Informants, indictments, betrayal, greed, and stupidity. If you want to take down a mob family, that's the recipe. Today's story is about how one of New York's most successful mob families destroyed itself. I'll be sharing with you some crazy unknown stories that if it was a movie script, nobody would buy it, but it's all 100% facts. Talk about a boss who cooperated and the fallout that's still impacting the family 20 years later. Welcome to Real Mob Stories. I'm your host, James Proctor. And without further delay, on to our feature presentation. At the turn of the millennium, the Bonanno crime family was riding high. Boss Joseph Big Joey Massino had rebuilt the family's strength after turbulent decades, even regained its seat on New York's Mafia Commission and earning a reputation as perhaps the most stable of the five families. By 2000, the Bonannos were considered the city's second most powerful mafia clan, behind only the Genovese. And Massino was held as the last Don because he was the only New York boss not behind bars. But this veneer of invincibility would shatter in the early 2000s when a whirlwind of indictments and betrayals devastated the family. So in 2002 is when the dam broke. That's when, for the first time, you had a Bonanno capo break a murder and turn state's evidence. That was Frank Coppa. And then after that, you had others that followed suit, including the acting underboss Richard Cantarella, and then also Joseph D'Amico. They all agreed to cooperate rather than face racketeering murder charges. And these early defections left Massino dangerously exposed. And then in January of the next year, the hammer came down. That's when Massino and his underboss, good looking Sal Vitale, who's also his brother in law, and several other capos were arrested in a massive RICO indictment. And so with that, Massino was denied bail, and Massino appointed the Bronx captain, Vinny Bassiano, as the acting boss in his place. But what followed after that was a cascade of betrayal, and it's unprecedented in mafia history. And so, facing the threat of the death penalty, and then spurred by Massino's failure to support his family after his arrest, Sal Vitale decided to flip in early 2004, agreeing to testify against his own brother in law. And Vitale admitted involvement in 11 murders, and he became the star witness in Massino's trial. And he ended up, because he cooperated, he actually received a time served sentence for his cooperation. Just crazy to me that someone with 11 murders could just get time served. And so Vitale's defection was the last of the seven Bonanno turncoats who lined up to testify. And, the family was gutted. But then in July of 2004, Massino was actually convicted himself on all 11 RICO counts, including multiple murders. And he was facing a certain life imprisonment, but also a possible death sentence for one of the murders. And then Massino did the unthinkable. He sought a deal to become an informant. So on the very day of his conviction, the 61-year-old boss privately told the judge he is willing to cooperate. And in doing so, Massino became the first sitting boss of a New York crime family ever to turn state's evidence. So the Bonanno family, once so proud of being the lone family that never produced a snitch during the Mafia's 1980s implosion, was now reeling from the betrayal of its kingpin. So Massino's capitulation marked the end of an era and beginning of the Bonannos' fall. So with Massino behind bars and talking to the feds, we now have Vinny Gorgeous Bassiano stepped up as the acting boss, and Bassiano was this flamboyant leader. He was from the Bronx, like I said. He had a dapper style. He's kind of similar to John Gotti in that way, but he got his nickname because of a Bronx beauty salon that he owned. And he was one of Massino's most trusted proteges, and so he assumed the day-to-day control after Massino was arrested in 2000. He tried to hold the family together through the crisis, but his reign would be short-lived. And unbeknownst to him, his former boss was now an FBI asset. And Massino's first major step of cooperation was to bring Bassiano down. And so, starting in November of 2004, that's when Massino started wearing a wire and recording, jailhouse conversations with Vinnie Gorgeous. Unfortunately, in one recorded chat, Bassiano confided to Massino that he ordered the murder of Bonanno associate Randy Pizzolo. He was calling the victim a rat, and um, basically this was crucial evidence for the prosecutors. And then in 2006, Bassiano gets convicted of racketeering charges, even though the first jury hung on the Pizzolo murder count. And then when the government retried him for murder, he got convicted of killing Frank Santoro. And this guy was someone that attempted to kidnap Bassiano's son. And so Vinnie Gorgeous gets sentenced to life in prison. So now with Vinnie Gorgeous sidelined by these indictments, the next boss was this little known guy named Salvatore Sal the Ironworker Montagna. So he was the acting boss during the mid 2000s, and he started out really young. He was 35 years old when he was made the acting boss, and he was a Canadian-born Zip. He was a Sicilian, and he got his nickname, the Ironworker, because he ran a successful steel business. But he rose quietly and quickly in the Bonanno ranks, and he was closely aligned with the Sicilian faction of the family, and he was close to some of the Sicilian wise guys like Baldo Amato. But during Montagno's tenure as acting boss, he had Nicky Mouth Santora's his acting underboss, and then he had his concierge was Anthony Rabito. And so what was meant to stabilize the family during the trials of Massino and Bassiano actually did the opposite. Things didn't improve. And so in 2007, the whole acting administration gets pinched. That included Santora, Rabito, and multiple captains like Josie Camerano and Jerome Massaro. And even though Matanya was able to avoid those charges, he wouldn't avoid, immigration. So he had never became an American citizen, and because of his criminal behavior, he was deported back to Canada. And so his end would actually happen in a few years later in 2011. He ended up trying, supposedly trying to take over the Montreal's Rizzuto family. Rizzuto family had always been close to the Bonannos, but they were kind of their own family. Although earlier in Cosa Nostra history, they actually were part of the Bonannos. But anyway, Montagna gets assassinated in 2011 because he was trying to take over the family. So after Montagna, then you had Bronx Capo Vinny TV Badalamenti assume the helm. So by 2009, the Bonanno's hierarchy was almost completely decapitated again and again. And there was a grim mob joke that said that the Bonannos changed bosses more than some people changed shirts. So the period from 2004 to 2010 was the worst period in the history of the Bonanno family. I mean, it was just chaotic. You just had a rapid succession of bosses and acting bosses and rival power centers, and the family just wasn't getting along. You had several different acting bosses, and they would come and go. Same thing with underbosses and concierges. And in fact, during this time period, over 75 Bonanno associates and made guys had been arrested and taken off the street. And so what had been around 150 made guys at the beginning of the decade was about half that at the end of the decade. As we start the decade of the 2010s, a new guy rises to the top. Not that he's new to the Bonannos, but new to the position of as a boss. So you had Mikey Nose Mancuso, and his turbulent tenure, that's what we're going to talk about next. And he was a Bronx street tough guy. He actually was part of the Purple Gang, and He was a protege of Vinnie Gorgeous. Uh, Mancuso was involved in the Pozzolo murder back in 2004. And in 2006, Mancuso was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But what's interesting is despite his incarceration, the family was able to make him the boss. It's just strange being named the official boss, even though he was still behind bars. And so this was what to me looks like a desperate bid for stability. I guess maybe a boss in prison was better than no boss at all. And then you had Tommy D. Fiore was the Mancuso's acting boss on the street. But even that arrangement didn't last as Di Fiore was arrested in early 2014. And that's when Joe C., which is Joseph Camerano, stepped in as the de facto acting boss during Mancuso's remaining years in prison. Mancuso gets released from federal prison in early 2019. He served about 12 of the 15 years. And the family that he returned to was little resemblance to the coherent crew that he remembered when he was on the street. And so during his incarceration, there was a serious rift that developed. And this was between loyalists that were tied to Joe C. and then loyalists tied to, the Mancuso faction. And so once he got out of prison, Mancuso wasted no time in reasserting his claim to power. And he's described by those that know him as a torpedo, a killer, and very feared. And Mancuso moved swiftly and ruthlessly to bring the family to heel, and he installed a new administration, purged those who opposed him. And with that, the result was even more instability. And so his whole tenure has been marked by internal disputes, shelvings, and even internal violence. And Mancuso's purge began in 2019, immediately upon his freedom. And he was angry about what he saw as betrayal during his absence. So Mancuso's problems weren't just limited to the disloyal administrators at the top. He also faced disobedience and dysfunction in the ranks. And so there were several other guys in the ranks that were shelved. So some of the more notable Bonannos that got shelved include a guy, John Spirito Jr. So he actually got shelved because he was sending fake messages purporting to be from the imprisoned Mancuso back to the Bonannos. And Spirito was doing this to advance his own agenda. And so that deceit earned him, being shelved. And also, he wasn't really good at his job. So Spirito had been responsible for collecting on an $80,000 debt for a Manhattan marijuana dealer, and he bungled it. And so his successor, who inherited the job after Spirito was shelved, only was able to recover about half of the money. So definitely, he wasn't didn't do a good job at what he was supposed to do. Then you had Vinny Goo Caroleo, and we don't know the real reason that he got shelved, but what we do know is that Joe C didn't trust him, and he had an associate that would follow Vinny Goo around, I guess to make sure that the money was getting collected and that he was actually turning in what he was supposed to. And it got so bad that he wasn't even able to turn over the money in person to his Bonanno superiors. It had to go to the associate, but he gets shelved. Then you had Simone Esposito, and he's an interesting story. He was the Bonanno family's concierge for a little while in the mid 2010s, but he fell from grace in 2015 because he was caught stealing $20,000 from the family treasury. And what this treasury was is kind of interesting. So this was to help soldiers and maybe even captains to be able to put money on the street. So let's say you wanted to borrow $50,000, you could borrow the money at maybe one point. So you'd have to pay back $500 a week, but you could put that money on the street and be able to get maybe 3, 4, or even 5 points on the money on the street. So it was a way to really help get the Bonannos to start making money again, because they'd been so decimated. And unfortunately, he stole $20,000. He was known as he was very greedy, and so he ended up being shelved. Then you have the crazy story of Tommy Carube. Carube was a veteran Bonanno associate. He'd been around since the 1970s, and he never wanted to get made. He had his own businesses. He kind of had his own thing going, and he just liked being an associate. But in 2014, he was under Peter Lavaglio. That was his captain, and his own captain was trying to muscle in on Carube's pizzeria there on Staten Island. And Carube was or Lavaglio was, really, trying to extort him. And he was getting threatened with violence and all that. So Carube actually turned to Esposito, Simone Esposito, the concierge, for help. And in a crazy, unorthodox solution, Esposito offered to have Carube made into the family as a protective measure, reasoning that a made man would be off limits for an angry capo to attack. But then there was a catch. Esposito wanted a $10,000 kickback in exchange for this favor. So Carube reluctantly paid half of it up front. So he paid $5,000. And then soon he was in a secret induction ceremony that was arranged in Queens. So he gets made, but less than 3 years later in 2017, the FBI approached Carube with evidence that he was in legal trouble. I believe it was on some bookmaking or gambling charges, and Carube agreed to cooperate at that time. So he became a confidential informant and started secretly recording conversations and provide intel on the Bonanno power struggle, before fleeing into witness protection. And so Carube's case epitomized the family's post Massino dysfunction, making a man who didn't want to be made essentially paying for protection from one mobster against another, and then ending with yet another informant in the ranks. So that's really what the Mancuso's tenure has been with, just a bunch of discord, incompetence, insubordination, and just became kind of a laughing stock, very much an embarrassment. But, let's look at Mancuso himself, though. I mean, I don't think he's fit to be a leader. He had a reputation for violence, that's well earned. Back in 84, Mancuso killed his own wife during a domestic dispute and served 10 years for manslaughter. I know that Dominic Shikali has said that it was an accident, but other people said Mancuso, did on purpose. And that dark personal history aside, he was known as a ruthlessly efficient killer when needed, and he's the type of leader who would rather whack a rival than compromise. So, I mean, I agree that fear can be an effective tool to control a mob family, and Mancuso certainly tried to leverage it. But honestly, fear alone, that's not going to that's not going to always work. He was shelving people, expelling various members, and it just made him look weak by doing that. It didn't make him look strong. And he was always having to worry about breakaway factions. I think a lot of the people within the Bonannos didn't like the guy, didn't really respect him. And what's interesting, Joe C. Camerano was actually well respected. He was well liked by most of the rank. So we'll end the show there. On the next episode of Real Mob Stories with James Proctor, we'll go into detail the Bonanno Civil War between the faction led by Michael Mancuso and the faction led by Joe C. Camerano. Although no Bonanno was clipped in this war, it was still marred by violence and betrayal. We'll talk about who won the war and also the fallout of the war, including the embarrassing incident at a beloved Capo regime's wake where the Bonannos tried to give Joe C. a beating at his own father-in-law funeral. Let me know your thoughts of today's show. Do you agree that the fallout of Joe Massino's betrayal still haunts the Bonanno family today? And what do you think about Mikey Knows Mancuso as the leader of the family? Was that the right decision, or was it one where the wrong person with the wrong temperament was elevated into the wrong position? I can't wait to see your comments. And please do me a favor and hit the like button. And also, if you have not subscribed to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor, please do so, because I have more of this content all the time. So until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.